Hi, welcome back to another episode of Knitting with Annie. I'm Annie Lepton of Boho Chic Fiber Co. Thank you for joining me today. Today is Wednesday and it is the first day of fall. Knitters love fall. If you're anything like me, most knitters love fall because it means we can start to wear our hand knits again. And I think a lot of people who tend to lose their knitting mojo over the summer start getting it back again. So all the knitters cheered. So it's the first day of fall, and this past weekend my family went apple picking, which is our favorite way to kick off the fall season. We have been apple picking every year except for last year, at least since my husband and I were engaged. Maybe even when we were dating we went. And it's like our favorite thing to do. We've been in Massachusetts, we've been in Maine, we've been in Michigan, we've been all over, everywhere that we lived. And so it was so fun. I guess I could share like a couple memorable stories from our apple picking would be fun. There was this one place in Michigan when we lived north of Detroit. We lived in St. Clair Shores, but it wasn't in that town. It was like northwest of the city. And there's one place we went to one year by chance, and I wish I could remember the name of it. If anyone happens to live in that area and knows what I'm talking about, link it below. But there was this one place where there were these crazy, like robotic, dressed up Halloween creature things, and the kids were just dying. They thought it was like the funniest and most exciting thing ever. There were these like there'd be like a truck with all these robotic like skeletons and like zombies and different things, and they looked so ridiculous, but the kids like got a trip. They just had so much fun. And there was this like giant climbing hay tower that you could go on. I mean, that place was, I think, my favorite place I've ever been to. And I can't remember the name because it was just like so long ago. But that was the funnest. There's a couple places in Massachusetts that we really like. We found a new place this year out in Natick. I think it's called Lookout Farm, something like that. And they're also a brewery, so we picked up some yummy like fall beers, which is fun. We love apple cider donuts, the whole thing. A couple years ago, my daughter got lost while we were doing it, my middle daughter, Eden, and she was lost for like 15 minutes. We couldn't find her. We were freaking out. And then eventually there was a police officer there who like somebody had taken her to, and we found her. But now it's kind of like the running joke, like every time. She was fine. Like she was a little upset, but it was fine. But we kind of like tease her like, oh, Eden, everybody check on Eden. Where's Eden? And she laughs. She thinks it's like funny now. At the time it wasn't funny, but now it's kind of like comical. And then last year we didn't actually get to make it because we had just gotten our puppy, and she was like, we didn't make it before we got her. And then once we got her, it was like there was no way we were gonna leave for like a whole day. So last year was the only year we missed, and we were super excited to get back to it this year. My plans for later today is I'm gonna make an apple pie, which I love making pies, so I'm excited for that. I guess that's it. I'm gonna get back to work after this. I'm getting ready to cast on. I'm gonna try to work out the numbers and plan out a design today so I can cast on tomorrow maybe, and a new yarn that I'm excited about. Maybe I'll share that with you later. And I guess that's all the update from me. I'm taking a week off Instagram, so if you haven't seen me there, it's fine. I'm okay. I like to do this I was doing it every like 3 or 4 months. Now I think I'm gonna do it every 2 or 3 months. Just take a week off. Don't sign on at all. I'll be back. It's just good for my mental health. I feel like there was just that study that recently came out that showed like how bad social media, and in particular Instagram, is like for teen girls. And honestly, I think it's every age we could benefit from like a little break from it here and there. It's really the main way I get the news out about my business, and so I you know, I need it and I appreciate it. It's like free marketing, but it's definitely gets a little bit like, every once in a while I get that kind of feeling of like not being good enough and like envious, and like you see other people doing like really, really well, or at least they're showing how well they're doing, even if that's not real. And so sometimes that gets a little like, makes you feel down. And so I find that if I just take a whole week off, what I try to do is I plan it. I look at my release schedule, and if I'm starting to feel like, ugh, I need a break, I'll look at my release schedule and just plan out if there's a whole week where I don't have any releases or anything coming out, then I'll just take that week off. And I usually feel much more refreshed and like ready to dive back in when I get back to it. So that's kind of where I'm at now. And yeah, I'm in the middle of that, so it's nice. And I guess that's it for the update. So I'm gonna go into a few of your questions for today. And then at the end, I'm gonna share about that new yarn to me that I told you about. And yeah, I think that's it. So let's see what questions I have today. So somebody asked, I'm a new knitter. When I stop in the middle of the row, I sometimes get turned around and cannot remember which direction to go in. So let's say these are your needles. And this is like pretty common for like brand new knitters, that it gets confusing which direction. Let me get a swatch or something real quick to see if I can demonstrate this a little better. So let's say this is my knitting here, and I'm knitting, and I end in the middle of the row, and I put it down and I go to pick it up later, and I get confused like which side am I on. It's actually a really easy fix. Some patterns it's gonna be really simple to see, because you'll just remember if you ended on like a right side or a wrong side, where in the pattern you can see, you know, was I doing something on the right side that required a different stitch pattern, and therefore I can like see where I'm at. But the easiest method for checking is your yarn, your working yarn that you're drawing from, that you're knitting with, is always going to be on your right side, wherever it ends. So if you're knitting along and you leave it, that tail end is always going to come out from the right side of the work. It's never going to be on the left. So when you pick it back up, look where that tail is coming out of, what stitch it's coming, you just last worked, and that should be on your right hand needle. And that's a direction. And if it's on the left, then you just need to turn your work. So that's a very simple fix, hopefully. As you get, like to new knitters, as you get more and more comfortable with knitting and you've been doing it longer, you'll start to be able to read your knitting. And reading your knitting is basically just understanding how stitch works and where you are in your work based on that. That's something that kind of, you need to do a lot of knitting. A lot of people have a hard time reading their knitting, like they can't necessarily figure out how they made a mistake because they can't tell what the stitches are doing just by looking at it. It's easier to learn how to read your knitting on just plain stockinette fabric or on like garter stitch. And once you get, you know, comfortable with that, then you start introducing like more complicated stitch patterns. It can definitely be hard to read knitting in color work is usually straightforward, but different stitch patterns like texture ones can be a little confusing. But don't worry, as you keep working, you will definitely gain confidence and you'll get more comfortable with that. But yep, so just remember that it's always coming from the right hand, the working yarn. Okay, the next question I had was about working colorwork designs flat. Someone had noticed that I have a handful of colorwork sweaters that are worked back and forth flat and not from the top down in the round. So they were wondering why I do that, and they were feeling intimidated that to try that out. They just kind of were nervous about working it flat, and wanted to know why I do that and just kind of more information about that. So yeah, typically color work is easier. I wouldn't say much, but it's easier and quicker when it's worked in the round, only on right side rows. So when you see top down sweaters, like the top down yoked sweaters, and there's color work on the yoke or the whole thing, and no matter how they do it, those are going to be worked in the round from the top down, and it's just easier to see the colors, and it's easier to knit. It's quicker and easier for most people to knit than it is to purl. And when you're carrying your yarn, you're carrying it on the back of your work, and it's just kind of straightforward and easy to do. Sometimes I need to do it flat for different reasons. Usually it's the construction of the sweater, it's the shaping of the sweater. So with a yoked sweater, let me just grab one to show you. Like this is my new design that's coming out next week. So with a yoked sweater, you see how like the slope of the shoulders is like more gentle. It's kind of like a curve when it goes down. So with this kind of sweater, yes, you're working in the round. It's all on the right side, easy peasy, no problems here. There's no reason to even work it flat because it's all on the round, the way that the sweater is constructed. For the reason that I typically use it, one thing you could use it for is if you were doing a top-down sweater like this, but you were doing a cardigan, you could work it flat, but even with that, it makes way more sense to do a steek in the middle where you cast on some extra stitches, and then you're gonna, there's a whole process, but you basically cut the fabric afterwards, and then it'll open up in the front like a cardigan. But that's easy to do on a sweater like this because you're just creating one down like the center front. So it's not like a huge change to the pattern. So that would be easy enough to do, and it'd be much quicker to still work it in the round and then just create the steek afterwards. But for sweaters that are like a drop shoulder, where they're like boxy fit, those patterns you're typically able to knit from the bottom up to the armhole on the round. And so that part's like not a problem to do with color work. I brought a few examples. So like this one here, you see how this top is like just straight. It's like a very boxy fit. This whole bottom section up to the armhole here, that's all worked in the round. So you're not gonna have that problem there. The problem is once you get to the armhole shape, not even shaping, just the armhole, you're gonna separate and you're gonna work the front and back separately of those two pieces. And when you do that, the other option, if you didn't want to work it flat, you could create two steeks, one on either end. To me, that always just seemed like way too much work to create two of them. I just work it flat. So for this top portion here, I separate it, and then I'm just gonna do the color work flat. The only difference is you need to pay attention to your charts, because when you're on the wrong side of the fabric, you're not gonna see the stitch pattern as well. And so I guess it's more likely that you could mess up the color work in some way. But if you pay attention to the charts and the pattern, it's usually not too tricky to follow. And when you're working on the wrong side, you just have to remember you're gonna be purling all the stitches this time, and that when you get to wrapping your stitches, you're just wrapping it in the front of your work as opposed to the back. Your floats are always gonna be on the inside of the garment, so you just make sure to wrap it in the front as opposed to the back. Some people, their stitch gauge will change from working in the round to flat for color work. So if there's a sweater like this, where you're working the bottom in the round and the top flat, you may want to knit two separate swatches in the color work to make sure. Mine does not really change in any noticeable way, so I don't bother doing that anymore, but I know that about myself. But if you are working one for the first time, or the first few times, it may be beneficial to go ahead and knit those swatches separately and compare them. And if one is tighter than the other, you can change needle sizes as you work to make it more evenly fitted all the way up the garment. And yeah, so basically I just use it when I need to for, like, if I want this boxy shape, but I also want color work on it, that's basically when I will use it. Some sweaters, if they're seamed on the sides too, and I want to work them, pieced, I will do it as well for that. So it kind of just depends on the construction of the pattern. But yeah, I hope that answers that question, is helpful. So this example here is my sweater. It's called Blaine. And that's an example of this. I have a couple other examples where I've done this in patterns. This one is called Lively. Oh, actually, you know what? This one's worked in the round, so forget that. This one you don't turn for. But this is one where the top section you do turn. This is the tile crop. And again, this part we worked in the round, and then once we get up here to the arm area, we turn it and work those sections flat. And then I have one more where I did that with, I have another one or two, but they're not, I couldn't find them right now. This one is called the Artist's Journey. And same thing with this one. This one has some texture, some cables in between the color work. But this one, same thing, I work in the round up to the arms, and then it's just this top portion up here by the arms. And then again, the sleeves are gonna be in the round. So typically it's just a small section of the pattern that is worked that way. So while it does slow you down a little bit, it's not like the whole pattern is like that and it's gonna take forever. I do have a pattern or two where the whole thing is flat, but if things need to line up in a certain way, but typically it's not, it's just a section of it. So just try it out, don't be too worried about it. If you really love a pattern, it's worth it to learn new skills and practice new ways of knitting to get the pattern the way you want it. So yeah. The next question I have is yarn substitutions. Someone is basically wondering if there's like a straightforward rule for substituting yarns. And for example, they had a merino, they had a pattern that called for a wool, mohair, and linen blend fingering weight yarns. I think they were held together is what it sounds like. And she's wondering if substituting a merino wool yarn with a sock yarn blend, a wool and nylon, so like a sock yarn with, okay, so it sounds like a wool yarn held with a sock yarn blend, if that would be a substitution, if that would be okay. Basically, there's no like major rules to substituting yarns. The only thing I can think of that like you really need to stick with is make sure that your gauge is going to be the same as the gauge recommended in the pattern. So sometimes you can achieve that by just substituting the yarn straight out with a different worsted weight yarn. You could just substitute. If it's two yarns held together, it's the same thing. You just want to make sure that whatever new yarn you're using or yarns held together, that it matches the gauge. And then beyond that, so that's about fit. So if the gauge is correct, then your fit should be similar to what's in the pattern. Sometimes a yarn is chosen for a particular reason for a design. With wool yarns, if it's all wool and you're substituting something that's also all wool, you're probably gonna have a pretty similar outcome. You wanna think of things like though switching from a plant fiber to a animal fiber. So let's say a sweater is worked in color work and it's all in wool and you wanna substitute cotton. That might be difficult. You can do it, but it may be a difficult substitution because when you're doing color work, cotton, it doesn't have the same stretch and give as a wool does. It's very just kind of tight. It doesn't want to move and stretch. And so color work with cotton is just a little trickier. You can do it, but that's thing to think about. Tensioning is just much more particular and you have to be very careful with that. If something is meant to be like a summery garment and it's worked in a linen and you substitute like a scratchy wool yarn, you just have to realize that it might not serve the same purpose as it was intended by the designer. Like instead of it being like a loose kind of summer top, you may get more of like a fall layering top. So you just have to think about what this fabric knits up to be. And if you're in doubt and you're wondering if it might be a good fit, look at the pattern and see what the intended fabric will end up being. And then you can knit a swatch in whatever yarn you're hoping to substitute and try to think, is this swatch something that I would want to wear with this design in this way? Like, is it going to fall the same way? Is it going to flow the same way? Or is it going to be like very tight? With things like alpaca, they have much more drape to them. They kind of hang more. Linen also has more weight. It'll kind of hang more and it might stretch more. So you just want to think about what you're substituting and if that makes sense for that particular design. Also think of things like if there's cables on the design. Certain yarns are just a little trickier, like linen doesn't show cables particularly well, whereas a nice round yarn will. If you're doing like socks and you want to substitute just like a plain wool yarn without any nylon, they just might wear out quicker in the heel, or they may, you may just get holes in them quicker, that sort of thing. So if it's something that you're like walking in, or like it's gonna get a lot of wear, like mittens or something, and the designer recommends a yarn with like some nylon in it or a certain number of plies in the yarn, you probably want to follow that, something similar to that, because it'll hold up better. Typically the more plies in a yarn, the stronger it's going to be and the longer it's going to hold up. And it often pills less than like a single ply yarn that's really soft. You're going to get more of those little round fuzzy pills on it that are going to break off, and it's not going to be as strong. And so it just really depends what you're knitting. If you're knitting a shawl, it probably doesn't matter what you substitute it with, but if you're knitting something you're going to be wearing a lot and breaking in, and you want it to last and you don't want to break it down, then you want to use a yarn that is more suited for that. So I hope that generally answers your question. I think the blend that you're talking about substituting, it would probably be fun if you meet gauge, but you just would want to, I don't know what kind of project it's for. So think about those things that I mentioned and if it would be suited for that specific project. So I have one more question and then a couple things to share with you. Somebody asked, do I have a favorite weight of yarn to work with? And it's hard to choose just one. Basically, I mostly design with fingering weight to worsted weight, or a heavy worsted. It's pretty rare that I use a lace weight yarn like on its own. Sometimes I've paired like a lace weight mohair with a fingering weight yarn. I don't love lace weight on its own. I've done a couple of designs with it and I find that my hands just really cramp up with needles that are that tiny. So I'm not a fan of lace weight on its own. I do have some designs in like bulkier, thicker, chunky kind of yarn. And it's fun every once in a while, but again, it's not like my favorite. It's fun to knit something up that's really quick, but it's usually just not my favorite to actually work with and knit with. And sometimes to wear it, it's great, and other times it's just like too much fabric, it's too thick. So yeah, I tend to go between fingering weight, like DK and worsted are my kind of staples. And it kind of just depends on the project. Like if I have a colorwork sweater, like this new one that's coming out, this one is, I think this was like a sport weight, so it's on the smaller side. The thinner the yarn, the more pattern repeats you're gonna get, like in a yoke or in a colorwork design, and the more stitches. So if you're doing a design that requires like a pattern to repeat, you know, if it's just a 6-stitch repeat, then you can do a worsted weight yarn and that's fine. But if you're doing like a 20-stitch repeat, you need more stitches so that you don't have a gap in your sizing, if that makes sense. So what I'll do is sometimes I'll decide what stitch pattern I want. And if it's something that's like a bigger repeat, or like my folk patterns where it's just one big motif on the front, I can usually get away with doing worsted weight. But if it's a repeat that needs like 20 stitches to make that colorwork section, then I know I'm not gonna fit that on worsted weight because I would just have fewer sizes. I would only have like 5 sizes because it's such a big repeat. But I usually typically do about 10 sizes. So if it needs a lot more stitches to make up that design, the colorwork design or the stitch pattern or whatever, then I'll know that I definitely need to work that in a fingering weight yarn. If I had to really pick a favorite, like one that I would only work with for the rest of my life, I think fingering weight allows for the most flexibility in your pattern design because like I said, you have more freedom and flexibility with how many stitches you're working with. But I do love worsted weight yarn. While you're not going to be able to fit everything in, I feel like it knits up pretty quick. I use a size 7 needle typically with worsted, which feels good on my hands. I don't get cramping with that size. Sometimes with the smaller needles, my hands will hurt. And so I just like how kind of it knits up pretty quick. And so yeah, I think worsted is probably my favorite. If I had to choose one for the rest of my life, it'd probably be worsted. And that kind of brings me to my next thing I wanted to share about is a new yarn to me that's a worsted weight yarn that I'm super excited to work with. It's Brooklyn Tweed's new Tones yarn. And that's what the label looks like. I think it's going to be backwards for you because it's a video. But yeah, so this new yarn is called Tones. And basically what they're doing with this yarn base, it is worsted weight. What they're doing with this one is they have the undertone and the overtone. So typically when I started out hand dyeing, if you want a yarn that looks kind of heathered, like you see this one is kind of like darker and heathered. You see there's like kind of like flecks of like a darker grayish tone underneath. That's created by, this one's the same. See how it's darker there with the flecks of like the grayish color? That is when you're over dyeing yarn. So what that means is you have like a darker yarn base to start with. Typically that means that you're mixing in like your regular white wool with a brown or a gray coated wool. And people usually will mix them to create a tone that they like a gray tone. Sometimes you could just use the darker wool. And then so they have the undertone yarns, which are the darker yarns. And then these are not the same colorways, but then I have two of the darker undertones. And then these ones are the overtones. And you can see there's still a little bit of color difference. There's still some of that gray, but it's much less. So it's like, it ends up being a brighter color, a lighter, brighter color. So what they're doing is they have a set of colors and they're dyeing the undertone and the overtone of each of those colors, which is really cool. So you can create a piece you could use one color and use both different tones and create like a different piece with that. What I decided to do is to just get 4 colors that I liked the most. I chose 2 that were undertones and 2 that were overtones, and I just really liked them together. And it creates kind of more depth, and I'm just really looking forward to making something with these. It's Columbia, I think it's all Columbia wool, which is it's woolly. It's a little scratchier than like a merino. It's not super soft, but it's very sheepy and farmy, but it's also not too scratchy. I don't want to scare people who don't like that kind of yarn, but I love it. It's great. I think you should definitely try it if you're into worsted weight. And I actually waited, I don't know how much they have left on their website. I waited a week or 2 after they released it, and like a lot was already sold out on their website. So I went to a few different yarn shops online and just ordered from different places to get the colors that I wanted. But I think they are doing a restock sometime or pre-orders, so you could check that out. Or look at your local yarn shop if they carry Brooklyn Tweed yarns. But yeah, I'm super excited. I'm gonna do something with some striping and also a little bit of color work, I think. And since it's worsted weight, it should end up pretty quick, which I always love. So yeah, that's the Tones yarn I'm really excited about. And I love these colors together. I just like, they're all like, I love them. So I'm super excited for this. And then I already showed you that new design, this blue one here that's coming next week. This one I ended up naming Dowses after one of our local beaches here that I just love. I just got really beachy, fresh water kind of vibes from it. And although the stitch patterns aren't like typically like beachy per se, the colors just really reminded me of like the beach and the blue sky and the blue water. So that'll be coming out next week. That's definitely one that I'm gonna pack for Rhinebeck. I think I'll do a video talking more about Rhinebeck as it gets closer, but maybe like sharing which sweaters I'm bringing or something. But that's definitely one I'll be bringing. That's one of my favorites I've done recently. Really excited about that release. And yep, I think that's it for today. If anyone was wondering, the sweater that I'm wearing today is my morning ritual. It's called Morning Ritual. It's a cardigan. If you can see the back, it has like this colorwork sun motif with the with these waves and a little bit of striping. It's a boxy drop shoulder fit, so it's really easy fit to knit. And then the sleeves are worked out from the body and the round. There's kind of fun, like the ribbing is striped, and it kind of matches the stripes here. And I love this one. Is another one where I was like kind of inspired by the ocean. Thinking about, I wanted a sweater that I could pull on in the morning. Like today, I walked the kids to the bus, I had my coffee, I had my sweater on. I know it's gonna warm up later today, so I'll probably take it off, but it's nice in the morning to just layer something cozy on. This one's knit up in Magpie Fibers. She's out of Frederick, Maryland, I think. She's got a lot of great colors, but any worsted weight would work for this one. I just love these like earthy kind of colors together, and I like that the waves are not blue, that it's kind of a little different. So it was kind of meant to be like the sun is rising over the ocean and you're doing your morning rituals in the morning as you wake up and have your coffee and read, whatever you like to do in the morning. So that's where I was kind of going with that one. Yeah, so I'll link that below as well as all those other links where you can submit a question or leave one in the comments below. And I will be back hopefully next week with a new episode for you and to share maybe a little bit more about the design that's coming out next week. So thanks for tuning in, and I'll see you later. Bye.